I'm the host of Discover the Oak Ridges Moraine video series, Susan Lloyd Swale. This video series is a journey in learning about the Oak Ridges Moraine through visual exploration and interviews with experts. The Oak Ridges Moraine, known as Ontario's rain barrel, is a major source of groundwater for the Greater Toronto Area and the lifeblood of Ontario's Greenbelt. But as you'll see in these videos, it is so much more. Welcome back. Here we are at episode 4. How was the moraine boundary determined? And is the moraine science-based? Join me as I interview Queen's University professor and land use policy expert Graham Whitelaw in the Happy Valley Forest. We're here today on Love Mountain. I just wanted to let you know that Love Mountain was donated by Anne and David Love to the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So we're very happy today to be here on the Oak Ridges Moraine. So as I said, my guest today is Graham Whitelaw. Can you tell us about the planning history, the role of conservation biology and biologists in the creation of the Oak Ridges Moraine Heritage System?
Thanks a lot. It's really nice to be here with you today on the Oak Ridges Moraine. What a beautiful spot. Yeah, so it's a really interesting history with respect to how science has been translated into the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan. So we have to go back a little bit and talk about environmentally sensitive area planning, first of all, as a process. And so some really thoughtful people at the University of Waterloo, including Dr. Paul Eagles, came up with this idea of environmentally sensitive area planning. And they applied that in land use plans, in municipal land use plans. So the idea was that plans have designations, and these designations have permitted uses. And if the permitted use isn't on that designation, then you can't do it. And so they thought, well, if you can have agriculture or urban or commercial or aggregate extraction, why couldn't you have environmental sensitive areas and have permitted uses that wouldn't include residential development? And so that was their idea. And today this is now ubiquitous in planning in Southern Ontario, and we now call it Natural Heritage System planning. So the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan was the first large application of natural heritage system planning. And so the real key drivers were a number of actors. First were citizens and environmentalists who were very interested in protecting the Oak Ridges Moraine, following on from the protection of the Niagara Escarpment. They really took their lead from what happened there.
Good.
Yeah, there's a really interesting story maybe I can share with you. So the NDP government, when they came into power in the early 1990s, they set up the Oak Ridges Moraine Technical Working Committee. And this committee was given the aim or purpose of carrying out studies that would eventually provide the government with options on how to protect the Oak Ridges Moraine. And one of the 16 studies they did was a natural heritage system study. And Geomatics International was one of the first consulting companies to be using geographic information systems, a mapping overlay process. And they used that to come up with the first natural heritage system iteration of the Oak Ridges Moraine.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that that first iteration had only 4% of the area in linkage or connections. That's connections between core natural areas. By the time the actual plan was done, because of conservation biology and the importance of science and being applied to planning, that increased to now we have a natural core area of 38% in the moraine. The natural linkage increased to 24%. And that's because these biologists in the Ministry of Natural Resources were pushing for 1 to 3 kilometer wide linkage areas.
Linkage areas.
Yeah.
Why are the linkage areas important?
Right, so from a conservation biology perspective, it's better to have core areas linked together for species and species survival. And so they can move back and forth. If one area starts to get degraded, they can move to another. And so survival of these different species is enhanced when you have connections.
So behind us there's a pond, and we saw a turtle out there earlier today, and I know there's a pond on the other side of the road. So is that what you mean by moving from one core area to another? Or
Yeah, that would be an example of two small core areas.
Okay.
And movement of turtles, and we saw that turtle actually on the road.
Yeah.
And that snapping turtle was moving from one area to another. That's
Right.
exactly right.
How were the boundaries of the Oak Ridges Moraine identified?
Right, again, this goes back to the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. And in the early 1990s, they started looking at the Oak Ridges Moraine in the Greater Toronto area and trying to figure out how to actually delineate that boundary.
Yes.
And they realized pretty quickly that they couldn't just use geologic criteria or geographic criteria. They had to think about how to bring a boundary that would capture all of the really important values of the Oak Ridges Moraine.
Okay.
And so that's the last time this whole environment of gravel, sand, silt, and other rubble that was left behind was manipulated by the glaciers. And so that's what the boundary they drew around. So we see features like Kames and Kettle Lakes,
Right.
and drumlins and eskers, all things that are glacial in nature.
Okay.
And so they're all found on the Oak Ridges Moraine. The southern boundary was harder
Yes.
to delineate, and so some really smart people at the ministry figured out that the 245-meter contour line was the line that would capture most of the values of the Oak Ridges Moraine. And so that's because in the south, till has overlain all of those interesting moraine features,
Yes.
but they're still there.
Okay.
They're still really important for aquifers. So that's why that boundary now forms the southern edge of the Oak Ridges Moraine. And it's really, really important. I really need to stress this, that we maintain that Oak Ridges Moraine boundary over the long term. A lot of effort went into this boundary. The Ministry of Natural Resources started the process. It was vetted through that technical working committee that I was talking about. And then many years later, 8 or 9 years later, the Oak Ridges Moraine Advisory Committee that was advising the Conservative government
Yes.
on what to do and with respect to protecting the Oak Ridges Moraine. They also agreed with this boundary, and that's the boundary that we now have for the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's not something that municipalities can just decide where this is in and this is out.
No, and you know, I'm not being critical here at all. A lot of this effort went in many, many years ago, and
Yes.
unfortunately planners are getting old like me,
Yeah.
who were part of that and are now getting out of planning, and
Yeah.
there's a whole new bunch of planners coming in. It's really up to us to be able to explain to these new planners how the Oak Ridges Moraine plan came into being, how the boundaries came into being, how the designations came into being,
Right.
and the importance of all of that.
Yes. Fascinating. Well, thank you for telling us that. Okay, so one more thing. Are the policies in the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan adequate to protect the ecological integrity of the moraine from urban expansion?
It's a really interesting question. I've been talking a lot about the plan. So the plan is part of the toolbox of protection, if we can think of it that way.
Yeah.
And that plan really works well because 90% of the Oak Ridges Moraine is in private hands. It's private ownership. And so that's why land use planning covers off all private land in Southern Ontario. So that's why it is very applicable. But we also have to have other tools in the toolbox. So
Okay.
for me, the other two really important tools are land acquisition for a natural, for a parks and protected area, which would go into the natural heritage system. And that would move lands out of private partnership into government hands for parks, or even nature conservancy lands or other land trusts for protection over the long term. And so that's really, really important because there's always going to be threats to the Oak Ridges Moraine, and maybe I can cover off my thoughts on that a little bit later. But
Okay.
the third tool is stewardship.
Okay.
And so we have to have ecological restoration
Yes.
taking place on the lands that are identified as core, linkage, and so on. And that's especially in the context of climate change.
Yes.
We need to make the area much more resilient and adaptable to a changing climate and issues of invasive species and that kind of thing.
Right. Fabulous. Interesting. And there's another land conservancy organization that works specifically on the Oak Ridges Moraine, the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust.
That's right.
And they do acquisition as well.
That's right.
So,
And
yeah.
they work very closely with the Nature Conservancy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much
Thank you.
for your
It's
insights.
a pleasure.
Wonderful. Pleasure.
Yeah.
Join us for new episodes to discover the Moraine. There's lots to choose from.